All right, guess what? We're here. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. And whoa, how is everybody doing? Are you new to the show? Welcome, if that's the case. Everybody else, what a friggin' week that was, huh? Woo, it's Saturday, and Pennsylvania did officially get called today. So apparently we do get to be rid of fuckface, although we'll get to see if that really happens or not. I mean, I believe it will happen, and that is a good thing. That's a good thing. I have to say, I got a lot of texts. If you were here last week, I mentioned I live in the state of Pennsylvania, and a lot of people were texting me saying, thank you, Pennsylvania, and I know a lot of people are celebrating today, and I get it. It's the promise of something. That's good. But I'm personally feeling very cynical. I'm not feeling very celebratory. I don't want to be a drag. But part of it is just I had some personal trials and tribulations this week outside of the election. And if you want to stick around today to the other side of the conversation, I'll be happy to share some of that with you. But even more, I just remember the promise I felt when Obama got elected. And frankly, that promise was not delivered on in so many regards. And in fact, I think that you could make a case that the Obama presidency led to what we've been dealing with. That's right, I said that. But you see, I'm in a really kind of a little downer mood. And then people are like texting me all celebratory, like my sister and some of my friends. And I kind of texted back a little bit of that downer vibe. And I felt bad because my sister said, hey, you know, I'm a woman. It's significant to me that there's a woman vice president. And I get that too. That is significant on some level. But I just think that, I don't know, it doesn't feel like we're at the end of the race, you know, that we can be celebrating so much. Okay, maybe I'm being too hard ass, you know? Maybe I am just in a bad mood because of other stuff. Like, again, I'll tell you about it later if you want to know. But I'm just finding it hard to feel celebratory about the Democratic establishment eking out a win with the same nothing campaign they ran 4 years ago and lost with. Like, they got lucky. He's just so bad that they get to win. And if there wasn't a pandemic, would Joe Biden be winning? I don't know. I'm not so sure. And I guarantee you, you're going to start to hear, if you haven't already, people say that the reason why it was so close is because Bernie and AOC moved the party too far to the left, and that really the country is more center-right. And I think that's bullshit. That's why, like in Florida, they voted for a $15 minimum wage, even though they voted for the president. That makes no sense. He's not for a $15 minimum wage. And there was a poll I saw recently where like 70% of people are in favor of government-run healthcare right now. But that's not even on the table on either of the parties. So I'm just saying, I got to admit, again, I've got my own personal stuff brewing. Like I said, I'll talk about it on the other side if you want to hear why I am the way I am today. But I don't know, maybe I'm just being a wet blanket. It's good that he's going to be gone. But what now is my question. What now? Fortunately, I have a wonderful conversation to share with you today with a woman named Heather Plett. She is the author of a book called The Art of Holding Space. And we recorded this conversation the day after the election, when everything was at its most scary and uncertain. And that was a risky thing to do. We scheduled it several weeks in advance, and I knew it was the day after the election, and I wasn't sure if that was the right thing to do. But given the nature of her work, which you're going to get to hear about today, I thought maybe it'll be okay. Maybe it'll be like a good thing for me and then in turn for listeners. And it definitely worked out that way. Heather was the perfect person for me to speak with. I got a lot out of it, and I am excited for you to hear it today. Real quick before we do, let me give some shout out to our podcast premium subscribers, because people who subscribe to the podcast premium are the ones really helping to sustain and support this show right now. And let's give particular shout out today to Daniel Rivera Catala and Ava Baumgartner. Thank you, Daniel and Ava. We really appreciate it. And if you listen to the show on the regular and you want to have access to the full archives, which is pretty extensive at this point, and just show your support, then becoming a podcast premium subscriber is the way to do that. It's a choose your own rate. And if you don't have any money at all, just email us. We will give you a free account. And we are just immensely grateful to everybody who does that. I want to also mention again, like I did last week, that we've got some promotional stuff happening for my on-demand videos. And if you want to get in on that, you need to be on the mailing list. So go subscribe to the mailing list if you've got any designs on getting some discounts on those on-demand videos. You can find out about the podcast premium subscription and subscribe to the email list at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all. Like I said, I've got some things I just want to get off my chest, but I'm going to do it on the other side if you want to stick around. For now, I say we just get to it. Let's go ahead and listen to this conversation that I had with Heather Plett. Heather, thank you. It's a pleasure to get a chance to meet you, and I appreciate you giving me some time on this day of all days.
Yeah, you're very welcome. It's a bit of a strange day. I think globally, probably a bit of a strange day. But
Well,
are you in the U.S.? Where are you based?
I am not only in the U.S., I am in Pennsylvania.
Oh, wow. So you're in that.
Yeah, and I moved here 3 years ago from Brooklyn. So okay. I knew I was moving to like a swing state, and I moved to like a particularly blue place in Pennsylvania, which there's less of those than there are the other way. Mm-hmm. And so it's just been particularly palpable, like the fraughtness of this election, and it's just like
palpable everywhere. I mean, I'm in Canada, so it's it should be removed from it, but it's very real for us here too, even though we're not voters.
Well, and also when we exchanged some emails and we scheduled to have this conversation the day after the election, there was a moment where I thought, oh, maybe that's not a good idea. Like, there's many topics that I talk about on the show, like, even just like yoga philosophy, or like, I don't know, pain science, or just different things that we talk about on this show that on this day would not feel right. Like I would have canceled.
Yeah.
But that we're talking about holding space felt like the only appropriate conversation to have on this day.
I think there's a lot of space for this conversation right now, and more every day with the complexity of what the world is going through, for sure.
Well, I mean, we're still in the midst of it. They're still counting votes. And for me, even if like they get him out, which is my hope, it still doesn't feel great.
Well, that's what I've been just really reflecting on and sharing a bit on my Facebook page too, is that this still means that an awful lot of people, chose his so many messed up principles that he stands on, white supremacy, racism, etc., chose that over their fellow countrymen who are put at risk by this kind of leadership. And that just feels disheartening.
I know. And I guess for me, that like the existential angst this morning, it has to do with, I just wonder about those people that you're referencing there, and I think to myself, are they just really terribly manipulated?
Yeah.
Or are people not good? You see, I always want to believe that life's inherently benign and like humanity
Yeah.
has a goodness at its core. But this morning, that belief is challenged.
Yeah, it's such a hard thing, and I don't know that there's really an answer or a way of quantifying it. But I think there's so much we don't yet know, or that we're learning about things like trauma and about manipulation, and just I've been studying a fair bit about cults and how cults really play on people's fears to suck people into a belief system. And I think all of that is showing up in what we're witnessing here, that people have you feed a certain fear in them, and then you offer them an alternative, and then they can be manipulated. And I don't know. I prefer, like you say, I prefer not to lean on the side of, the people are bad. I want to find, but at the same time, it feels like they have all the evidence and they still make the choice. So that is hard to reconcile.
Well, I do know I've been talking a lot about like polarization and not wanting to further perpetuate polarization. So even in the way that we've described it, that they've been manipulated, like some people might suggest that we're fueling polarization when we do that. Like, isn't it a little pompous of us to do that? But at the same time, it's hard not to, because you have a belief system that you believe, like for me, what it comes down to is the utter display of a lack of empathy, like no empathy.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I was going to say, if you're a yoga person and you like believe in interconnectedness, it hurts you. It hurts me in my soul.
It does, and that's the pain of it, because I keep checking in with myself too. Like, what is my own arrogance? What am I not seeing about my own blind spots? What am I failing to, reveal to myself because I think I'm on this side of good, etc. But I keep coming back to the fact that people I care about, people who have been marginalized for years, people who come from oppression, who have, a history of slavery in their lineage. These are the people that are being hurt by this. And I just can't quite get past that and get past the damage being done to humanity. And even, I want to see the humanity in the people that are voting for this person, because I know they're coming from a place of fear, but it's just it's so hard to reconcile the whole thing and justify those decisions.
I know. But I guess I've been really working at it, especially living here in Pennsylvania. It's like I don't want to, like, I wouldn't put out a lawn sign. My wife was like, should we put out a lawn sign? I was like, no, I don't think we should do that. Just because I didn't see that turning anybody's vote. And I saw it as more of a polarizing thing than like a place to open dialogue or anything like that.
Yeah, I'm curious about that too, because I've talked to a few friends in the US too that were reluctant to put stickers on their car, reluctant to put out lawn signs. And that feels, as a Canadian, that feels quite foreign to me, because I've never felt that there was risk in me putting out a lawn sign. My neighbor and I have different lawn signs usually, and it's never felt like there was a significant reason not to. And just to represent who, or just, show your allegiance and what you care about. But at the same time, there feels like there's a level of fear in your country, but those people saying, and I'm not judging you for why you didn't put the sign out, but I'm curious about that. What's going on in your country right now that there's such a deep divisiveness that putting out a lawn sign, it doesn't feel like the right thing to do. And yet you see these big convoys of half-ton trucks with these huge flags that are driving, down freeways and stuff and blocking traffic. And that, on the other side, they're very, very much, their allegiance is really, really clear, and they don't have any reluctance about flying that flag. So that's a bit of a curiosity for me.
Well, I think that there's certainly the fear on the one side that, their idea of America is changing, or the brown people are taking the jobs, or there's a fear there that fuels, I think, that side of that equation. The fear on the other side to not put out a lawn sign, I think, I don't even know if it was so much fear for me, because I think there were times in my life where I would have invited sort of confrontation or something.
Mm-hmm.
But I just think that if I was looking at the effect of it, like, what does the effect of me putting that lawn sign have?
Yeah.
It wasn't like spirit for my candidate, because we're not in a place where we're having a fruitful, dialogue on issues or whatever. You know what I mean? We're in this like frontal cortex lizard brain place or something right now.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to, have nuanced conversations, but I have to admit that was the other existential question this morning, is like, what's the point? I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, I think there's a point. I don't mean that, but at the same time, that's the feeling I have.
Yeah, it's hard not to just be in a place of despair over it. And I am trying really hard, as a person who's in Canada, who has a certain amount of influence with my community, to put a meaningful message into the world right now that offers something into that space of despair. And it's a difficult place to speak into, for sure, right now, for all of us, I think, to hold to something that continues to have meaning. And I posted a quote this morning from Margaret Wheatley, something about in her book. She really wrestled with despair at one point, and she put out this after really wondering what the point of it all was. She just started to look at climate change and all these things that just feel like we're on a trajectory we can't save ourselves from anymore. And she came to the conclusion that those people that inspired her the most were the people who'd kind of let go of hope, and it didn't need to have hope to drive what they were doing. They just knew it was the right thing to do, and they kept showing up every day to do it, even if it was just about their own spirit and their own little bubble in the world. They knew that was the only way they could live, is to continue to show up. And so that's the message that I feel like I'm going to continue to stand on. We just keep showing up, and we have to keep doing the next right thing.
Well, that sounds very useful. The idea that you can have purpose, even if there's like a lack of hope at the moment.
Yeah.
And maybe even have determination or something. Yeah. But I hear you. And it does bring us to your book and the whole idea of holding space, because it sounds like what you're talking about is exactly what that idea is about. And it's interesting because we've had this conversation in my teacher's call. I have this weekly teachers meeting that I've been doing for over a year now. And I have these teachers from all over the world. And we had several meetings just on this idea of what does it mean to be holding space? Mm-hmm. Like even the wording of it, like holding space, like what do we mean by that?
Yeah.
And I think teachers all intuitively have a sense of of some idea that's pointing to, because they've had to, because of the role they're playing when they decide to try to be a teacher.
Right.
But I don't know. It's always interesting to see if you can put some words to it and articulate it some and have more clarity about it. And that's what I was really appreciating about with your book.
Thank you. Yes, I often say I didn't really choose this work, but it chose me. And it was almost like this concept of holding space was needed in the world, and was being born all over the world, and needed some people with some skills and articulation to give it some language. And I was kind of chosen, in whatever way you want to interpret that. And so I had to just show up and start to give language to this concept that feels a little, ephemeral or something. Like you can't it's hard to touch exactly what it is. And so, but it started to really evolve for me when I sat at my mom's deathbed as she was dying, and witnessed the palliative care nurse who came to support us. And just, there was something that I witnessed in the way that she showed up to support us that just provided a certain amount of strength for us to lean into, just enough knowledge for us to know what we needed to do in the next moment. Not that it wasn't clarifying the whole experience for us, but it was just enough information and support. And the way that she just offered this gift of a container for us to be present in, to experience this really complex thing of having a mother die, and not to change the experience for us, not to direct it, not to judge it, just to support it and support us in moving through that. So that's really where it started to crystallize for me as a concept, and since then it's become my life's work to continue to wrap language around this concept to help people who have an intuitive sense of it but don't necessarily know how to explain it. And so I try to offer something that gives them that language.
Well, it does seem like the stars align some because you have a history of writing, and then it was personal experiences, which I find intriguing, because one of the things that we talked about is, can you actually train someone in how to hold space? And there's people who've come up with different like exercises on how to do that. And I would just say, just to resonate with what you were saying, that myself, like everything that I do as a teacher or doing the show, it comes down to this desire to like want to connect and have real communication. Mm-hmm. And that all comes from an experience I had at my mother's deathbed when I was 16. And I guess I'm sort of curious about that. Like, there does seem to be something about when you face deep tragedy, death in particular, that lends itself in this direction. And yet I do have like other relatives of mine who it didn't have that same effect, sure. It didn't take them in a holding space kind of direction, let's say. But what do you think it is about like deep tragedy or death that gives us that circumstance?
I think we reach this, we potentially do. And I don't say all people, because we all have different journeys through this, but those of us that have a certain consciousness around this work, or we're tuned in a certain way. I think there's something about that experience of walking with someone through death that is a sort of vision quest for us. And it gives us, and I talk in my book a lot about liminal space, about the space that's between the old story and the new story. And in that liminal space, if we lean into it and we move through it, and that's really being with someone as they're dying is a really profound liminal space, there's this capacity to see things differently. It's like the veil kind of moves from our eyes so that we have a different opportunity and different capacity for seeing the world and witnessing what's going on. And I've experienced that multiple times. And really the first time, even though the holding space language really landed when my mom died, it started about 12 years before that. I had a stillborn son. And in the 3 weeks before my son was born, I was in the hospital trying to save the pregnancy. And it was a really profound liminal space, waiting to see if my son would survive. And that experience is really when it awakened in me. I say that was the beginning of my spiritual quest to find meaning, to find a different way of living in the world. And I think in leaning into that experience and being present and really holding death in my body, essentially, because he died in my womb before I birthed him. And that experience completely changed me. And like you say, I know other people that didn't have that depth of experience, but I think, there's certain people that have a certain way of being tuned into that differently than other people do, that whether it's a calling or whether it's some unique thing about, if it's an Enneagram thing or something about our personality, we just tune into it and can pick up something that's going on in that moment that gives us a sense of clarity about how to show up differently in the world and how to support other people through that.
Well, I really appreciate this idea of liminal space. It's something I've been talking about recently in the context of the yoga world, in the sense that for a long while, I think people were really trying to mainstream yoga. and it was becoming more of like a fitness or a science thing. But it's really a place where like I worked through deep emotional stuff, and that required kind of a liminal space. And what I find interesting about that is sometimes when I've talked about it, liminal space, it almost in some people's minds feels like it's going to be all like unicorns and rainbows and something and all bliss. But it's actually, you wrote like it's messy and like scary, and it often involves like things falling apart or destruction.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a surrender to the liminal space. And I use the metaphor of the caterpillar that has to surrender to the chrysalis. And in the chrysalis is just a gel-like goo substance it doesn't resemble the caterpillar or the butterfly. So it's a surrender to this messiness of and the unknown space. And in order for that transformation to happen. And so that space, there's a lot of discomfort there. And there might be joy. Like, I don't want to shut down any emotional experience because I think that all of them happen in that journey. But there is something about it that's going to change you if you allow yourself into that space. And I think one of the chapters of my book is about bypassing. I think we all have tendencies to try to bypass that liminal space and stay above it. And you talk a little bit about the yoga world, and I've had that experience too, where some yoga has evolved into more of a fitness thing. It's more goal oriented, and really to hold space, I think we have to be prepared to release attachment to outcome. And that's, I think yoga does a beautiful job of that. When it's done with a spiritual kind of lens, is no, this isn't about a certain goal. This isn't about getting you to a certain weight or a certain fitness level. This is about holding the container for you so that your evolution can happen in this.
And that's exactly, I wrote a note to myself that you wrote that to hold space is to release attachment to outcome and learn to sit with discomfort and ambiguity. Mm-hmm. And that as like a definition, like a clear definition for the idea of holding space. Although I think there's more to it than just that, but as like a baseline idea, it goes to what you were just saying. And I think yoga does lend itself to that kind of facility where you can just be okay, even if things aren't seemingly okay.
Yeah, and that's the complexity of this. You mentioned earlier about whether or not we can teach something like holding space. And I have an 8-month program, and I've now just developed a certification program, which we're just building for holding space practitioners. We're just running the first one right now. And at first, it took me a long time to get to a place where I felt like I could teach this. Like, it felt like, really, it feels like an intuitive thing, and I'm not sure that I have capacity, but more and more people kept asking me to give them guidance and wisdom in this. And so I did start the practice of trying to teach people. And what I discovered early on is it's not so much teaching people how to hold space, because that's a little utilitarian. That's a list of 10 easy steps to get to a certain destination.
Right.
What's much more true for this practice and for the learning that we offer in our program, and I've just co-founded the Center for Holding Space. What we practice in that is much more about self-awareness, so that you're paying attention, so that you have the consciousness to get your own ego out of the way, to get your own baggage out of the way, to heal the trauma that might be a barrier for you holding space for the other person. And then once you have that consciousness, then you can pay attention to, okay, what does this person need? Now that my ego's not tripping me up and I'm not getting triggered by who knows what can I, how can I lean into presence that is in support of this person's journey? So that's what the training is much more focused on. And people are always quite surprised when we get to the second module, which is about holding space for yourself, because it's much more complex than they expect. They show up thinking it's a good way to learn to support other people. And then we take them on this deep dive of, oh, wait a second, I've got to look at my own blind spots and biases, and what are the things that are tripping me up, so that I can be that container, that support for another person.
Well, isn't that interesting that in order to hold space for others, there's like some stuff you got to do for yourself first in order to be able to do it?
Yeah, exactly. And the concept I teach when I talk about holding space, I talk about being the bowl for other people. So it's creating a container for other people to hold whatever they're going through. And I say that if you're wobbly, you're not gonna hold that bowl very well. Like if you haven't worked on your core, on your, yesterday, for example, in our certification practice, we were talking about stillness, how to find your own stillness so that you wobble less, so that you don't have you're not trying to control the outcome for the other person. And that's a long and complicated journey to get to that. And I'm still on the journey. I think we probably all are to the end of our days. But it's a really intentional practice so that we have that strength.
Well, I do think back to the other thing you were talking about in terms of training. I do think that there's things that can be shared and imparted and certainly modeled, like in the same way that woman coming to your house to help you and your mom through that moment gave you like some kind of example. I think sometimes people learn these kinds of things in that kind of way, which is interesting because it's one of the things like yoga that I don't think lends itself to being standardized. Like certainly you can develop organizing principles, and you can develop like containers for experiencing that people can have together, and there's all kinds of things I think that you could do. And I was curious because I saw that you were involved in this called the Circle Way. And I had someone else on to talk about sociocracy, which was like another kind of like way of organizing and communicating. So it does seem like some of what we're talking about in terms of imparting these things, it's a process-oriented thing. And that's why it's hard to reduce it down to like 10 bullet points or something.
Yeah, because and even I've long been a practitioner of the Circle Way and the training in the Circle Way. We can give you the tools, we can give you the principles and the practices, and you can put them into place fairly easily. You can pick up a talking piece and you can use some of those simple kind of methodology for this hosting a circle. Just like in yoga, you can probably teach somebody 10 practices or something of yoga, and that's a sort of simplified approach to it. But the depth of that is like, do you now know what you're going to do when this person has an emotional breakdown in your circle, or there's trauma that shows up in your circle, or there's whatever complexity, there's conflict in your circle? What's now going on in your body that is responding to this? And what do you need to do to hold it? That there's so many more layers under that. So I do try, I've written a whole book about it. I've tried to break this down into components that are fairly easily identifiable, because I want people to be able to look at an experience. If you evaluate an experience and you think, well, did that person hold space for me or didn't they? And so you have some sense of what is happening in that moment. What's the kind of magic that's being offered to you or that you're offering another person? You do have capacity to kind of analyze that. But at the same time, that's not just the easy roadmap to getting there. It still involves this really, it's a practice, and it's learning. One of the practitioners that's in my training team, she talks about building the muscle of holding space. It's really about growing, constantly practicing so that we grow more and more strong in the practice.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And particularly to that point, it seems like this idea that there's like someone holding, like me holding space for someone else. There's me holding space for me, right?
Right.
And then there's letting someone else hold space for me.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes like teachers, like we develop this muscle, like you were saying, of being the bowl, and maybe even doing a good job of doing the work we need to be a steady bowl. But sometimes that's where I feel like I'm not always very good at like letting myself be held.
Yeah, and that's So what I've developed when I was developing the kind of understanding of the bowl, I ended up developing it into a 3-layered bowl, and this is the components of what holding space is really. And so the inner layer of the bowl is what you're offering that other person. So it's things like compassion, it's selective non-judgment, it's selective guidance, those kinds of things, and then the inner layer of the bowl, the guts of the bowl, is what you're using within you, to the qualities that you're using in order to offer those things. So it's it's your intuition, it's your curiosity, it's your courage, it's your discernment, making good decisions. And then the outer layer of the bowl, that's what's holding you so that you can offer it to the person that you're holding space for. And I've only put 2 words in that outside container, and really the words are intertwined. It's mystery and community. And it's really about who's your community, who's supporting you so you can do this work. And the mystery is whatever you see as your spiritual container. And I purposefully don't define that too much. I don't want to be dogmatic about it, but I want people to witness that you're being held by a force beyond you, and you can call it love, you can call it spirit, you can call it earth, but there is something that supports you that you can lean into. And I think if we ignore that, and if we only focus on what we're offering to the other person and we don't see what we're leaning into, that's when our ego gets in the way. And that's where you see these gurus who end up becoming cult leaders, who end up doing damage to their community because people worship them, and it gets so messed up. It's because nobody's holding them accountable, nobody's challenging them, etc. And if we don't have that piece, that's when we're going to start to do damage. So I'm really intentional about teaching people, make sure you've got that support, because otherwise this work is going to either crush you or you'll get too trapped in your own ego.
Yeah, I feel like that's so true, that in order to be effective at holding space for others, it required, at least in my experience, like being really transparent and like vulnerable. like that is the work of it ultimately. Like allowing myself to be vulnerable as a kind of key element, it seems to me, to keep myself honest, like you say. So I don't, so that I have, that I'm not just tooting my horn. I don't know even how to say it, right? Even like, I've heard you talk about this too, where I will often talk about my mother's deathbed in like a workshop, because it's so fundamental to my understanding of what I'm doing. And there are times where I question that, like, am I using that as material or something? Right. Like, am I cheapening the story?
Yeah.
I tried doing it without, and it didn't work the same. That there was something about, if I am really being honest and I am really making myself vulnerable and sharing this deep thing about myself, it kind of gives people permission or sets this example where other people then feel licensed to explore that in themselves as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's always a bit of a tricky balance, because we can, and I teach some writing workshops as well, and people always ask me, how do you know when you're ready to share your own story? And I have a set of questions that I offer people. I say, go through these questions, ask yourself, is it a story that I feel like I've healed enough that people can't wound me with it? If somebody responds to it in a certain way that I'm too sensitive around that story. B, is it a story that is mine to tell, or do I need to check in with other people that are involved in this story before I start to share it? And then also, what's my relationship to the story? Do I have pride in the story? Do I have an ego involved that really wants people to think I'm important? And it's a bit of a self-analysis. Is this story meant as gift, or is it meant to prop me up or make me look like a really smart teacher? And I don't always get it right. I still don't. And even as I was writing the book, there's moments where it's like, okay, is this story of value? Is it gift, or is it me trying to look interesting? And maybe we never get it perfectly right. And maybe sometimes it's right for one person and not so right for the other person. Another person will roll their eyes and think, oh, she's talking about herself too much again. I don't really know. I don't know there's a perfect answer to that, but I think we do our best, and we try to be conscious of offering those stories as a gift to the people who come, and hopefully they can receive it that way.
Well, I think that's an example of what I was talking about. You just demonstrated like a transparency and told us all of that. And in a way, it's almost like from what I get from you, if it were to come to your awareness that you did do, you would be the first to admit it.
Right, exactly.
And that is what I mean in terms of like keeping it honest.
Yeah.
As long as you're willing to admit your own frailties and misgivings in your process, and you're not like trying to hide that, or that you're letting that be part of it, because that is the process that you're describing of being able to hold space, right?
Yeah, and that's always been my philosophy. Like I'm going to admit my mistakes before other people get to them.
Yes, it's much safer for me too. Yes, if I admit it, no one else can get me on it. Yeah,
yeah, and that doesn't mean over apologizing for things or being too self-deprecating. I don't believe in that either. But I'm going to, if you call me out on.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.